ID. Let's go.
Right here.
All right, step outside for me.
Before you look at the wall, that's me and my mom. This is my house.
Outside, now.
Smith,
Let's go. Turn around. Hands behind your back.
you're making a mistake. Just call my mother at the hospital. She'll tell you.
The digital timestamp on the body camera reads 3:12 in the afternoon. It is a Thursday, the kind of mild autumn day when the leaves have just begun to turn golden and the air carries that particular crispness that makes everything feel slightly more alive. Officer Derek Holloway adjusts the strap on his tactical vest as he climbs the weathered brick steps of a comfortable colonial-style home on a tree-lined street in the Riverside Heights neighborhood of Millbrook, Ohio. His boots make a soft scraping sound against the concrete, a mundane detail that will later become part of the permanent record of what is about to unfold. He has no way of knowing that the next 45 minutes will dismantle everything he has built over the past 8 years. His badge, his pension, his marriage, his standing in the community where he grew up. All of it is about to come crashing down because of choices he is mere moments away from making. Choices rooted not in evidence or proper procedure, but in something far more insidious, something he would never admit to, perhaps even to himself. The assumptions he carries with him up those brick steps will collide with reality in a way that exposes the dangerous intersection of bias and authority. And when it is over, nothing will ever be the same. Before we go any further into this story, I want to ask you something. If you have ever witnessed a situation where someone was treated unfairly based on how they looked, or if you have ever wondered what you would do if you found yourself on the receiving end of that kind of treatment, this story is going to hit close to home. I encourage you to stay until the very end because the consequences of what happens here go far beyond one officer and one wrongful arrest. And if this is your first time on this channel, consider subscribing because we dive deep into cases exactly like this one, cases that reveal uncomfortable truths about the systems we trust to protect us. The dispatch call had come through at approximately 2:45 that afternoon. A concerned citizen had reported what she described as suspicious activity at 892 Thornwood Lane. The caller, whose voice carried the particular certainty of someone who believes they are performing a civic duty, explained that she had observed an African-American male entering and exiting the property on multiple occasions over the past 4 days. She emphasized that the homeowner, a retired schoolteacher named Eleanor Chambers, who was in her early 70s and white, lived alone and had been hospitalized for nearly 2 weeks following a knee replacement surgery. The caller expressed concern that someone might be taking advantage of the elderly woman's absence to burglarize her home. She mentioned that she had never seen this particular man in the neighborhood before and that his presence made her uncomfortable. Officer Holloway received the call without hesitation. At 36 years old, with 8 years on the Millbrook Police Department, he considered himself a seasoned veteran capable of handling whatever situation might arise. He had responded to countless burglary reports, trespassing complaints, and welfare checks throughout his career. In his mind, this was routine. Drive to the location, assess the situation, and if the circumstances warranted it, make an arrest. Simple, straightforward. The kind of call he had handled hundreds of times before. What Holloway failed to do in those 17 minutes between receiving the dispatch and arriving at Thornwood Lane would later become the subject of intense scrutiny. He did not run a comprehensive background check on the property. He did not verify the identity of the caller or attempt to corroborate her claims. He did not check whether any recent police reports had been filed from that address. He did not contact the hospital to confirm Eleanor Chambers was actually a patient there. Most critically, most devastatingly, he did not take even a moment to determine who might have legitimate access to the home, who held keys, who was authorized to be there, who might be family. These were not complicated investigative steps. They were basic police work, the kind of foundational procedures that separate professional law enforcement from dangerous assumption-making. A simple property records check would have revealed that the home at 892 Thornwood Lane was listed under the names of both Eleanor Chambers and her son, Michael Chambers, who had grown up in that very house and still maintained it as his legal address for certain purposes. A call to the hospital would have confirmed not only that Eleanor was a patient, but that her son had been listed as her emergency contact and primary caregiver. Any of these steps would have changed everything, but Officer Derek Holloway did not take them. He was already convinced he knew what he would find when he arrived. The patrol car rolled to a stop in front of the colonial home at 3:09 in the afternoon. Holloway sat behind the wheel for a moment, surveying the scene. The house was well maintained, with a neatly trimmed lawn that showed signs of recent care. A silver Lexus sedan sat in the driveway, its finish gleaming in the afternoon sunlight. The car was clean, clearly looked after, with no visible damage or signs of having been abandoned. The license plate was current and properly displayed. To an objective observer, this might have suggested that whoever was inside had every right to be there, that this was not the scene of a crime in progress, but simply a home being tended to in the owner's absence. But Holloway's mind had already constructed a different narrative. He had received a report about a black man entering a white woman's home while she was hospitalized. In that mental framework, the nice car became suspicious rather than reassuring. The well-kept lawn became a cover story rather than evidence of legitimate caretaking. Every piece of information that should have given him pause was instead filtered through the lens of his predetermined conclusion. He stepped out of the patrol car and approached the front door. His hand moved instinctively to rest on his service weapon, not drawing it, but positioned in a way that communicated readiness for confrontation. His body language was that of an officer expecting trouble, not one approaching a routine inquiry. The body camera captured all of it: the deliberate pace, the tension in his shoulders, the way his eyes scanned the windows as if looking for signs of criminal activity. Later, experts would analyze this footage frame by frame, noting how Holloway's demeanor from the very beginning suggested he had already made up his mind about what was happening inside. He knocked firmly on the door, 3 sharp raps that echoed in the quiet afternoon air. A dog barked somewhere down the street. A car passed on the road behind him. Ordinary sounds of an ordinary neighborhood on an ordinary Thursday. Approximately 40 seconds elapsed before the door opened. The man who appeared in the doorway was tall, perhaps 6 feet 2 inches, with a lean build and close-cropped gray hair that suggested he was somewhere in his mid-40s. He wore pressed chinos, a pale blue Oxford shirt with the sleeves rolled to his elbows, and reading glasses pushed up onto his forehead. His expression was calm, perhaps slightly curious, as one might expect from someone interrupted in the middle of a task. There was no alarm in his face, no guilt, no nervousness, just the mild surprise of finding a police officer on the doorstep. His name was Michael Chambers. He was Eleanor's only son, a certified public accountant who lived in Columbus, about 90 minutes away. 5 days earlier, he had driven to Millbrook after receiving word that his mother's surgery had gone well, but that she would need an extended recovery period. She had asked him specifically to stay at the house while she was hospitalized. "Water the plants," she had said. "Bring in the mail. Make sure the pipes don't freeze if the temperature drops. Keep an eye on things." These were the instructions a mother gives a son she trusts completely, the kind of ordinary family arrangement that happens in homes across the country every single day. Michael had every legal and moral right to be in that house. It was his childhood home. He had a key that his mother had given him decades ago. His name appeared on various documents related to the property. Neighbors who had known the family for 30 years could vouch for his identity. His mother, recovering in a hospital room 12 miles away, could confirm everything with a single phone call. But Officer Derek Holloway was not interested in any of this. Not yet. Perhaps not ever. The body camera recorded every word of what followed. Holloway did not introduce himself properly. He did not explain why he was there or what had prompted the visit. Instead, his first words were a demand. He asked to see identification and wanted to know what the man was doing inside this residence. His tone was not the neutral professional inquiry of an officer gathering information. It was accusatory from the very first syllable, carrying the unmistakable weight of suspicion. Michael remained composed. He explained, in a measured and polite voice, that Eleanor Chambers was his mother and that he was staying at her home while she recovered from surgery. He offered to show his identification immediately. He even suggested helpfully that they could call his mother at Millbrook General Hospital to verify everything he was saying. These were the responses of an innocent man with nothing to hide, someone who assumed that a simple misunderstanding could be cleared up with basic communication. Holloway barely glanced at the driver's license when Michael handed it over. The name on the card read Michael Thomas Chambers. The address listed was this very house, 892 Thornwood Lane. The last name was identical to the homeowner's. These details should have stopped Holloway in his tracks. They should have prompted him to reconsider his assumptions, to ask follow-up questions, to actually investigate, rather than simply enforce his preconceived conclusion. Instead, he looked at the ID for perhaps 3 seconds before handing it back. He told Michael to step outside onto the porch. His tone made it clear this was not a request. Michael complied, moving slowly with his hands visible, the way a person does when they understand that any sudden movement might be misinterpreted. He stepped onto the front porch of his childhood home, the same porch where he had sat as a teenager watching summer thunderstorms roll across the Ohio sky, and found himself being told that he was being detained for investigation of burglary and criminal trespass. Let me pause here for a moment, because I want you to fully absorb what is happening. A man is standing on the porch of the house where he grew up. He has a key. He has identification. He has offered to call his mother, who can confirm everything. And instead of taking 60 seconds to verify any of this, a police officer has decided he is a criminal. Think about what that feels like. Think about the powerlessness of knowing you have done nothing wrong, but being treated as if your word means nothing. If this kind of story makes you angry, or makes you want to understand how these situations happen and what can be done about them, drop a comment below. Tell me what you think about what you are hearing so far. And if you are not already subscribed, now might be a good time, because this story is only going to get more intense from here. Michael's demeanor shifted from cooperative to concerned. He explained again, more urgently now, that this was his mother's house and that he had been staying here with her knowledge and permission. He offered to provide phone numbers for aunts, uncles, cousins, anyone who could vouch for him. He suggested they contact Millbrook General directly and ask for Eleanor Chambers' room. He even offered to walk Officer Holloway inside and show him the family photographs that lined the hallway, images that documented decades of his life in this very home. Holloway dismissed every one of these suggestions. He was not interested in verification. He was interested in processing the arrest he had already decided to make. He reached for his radio and called for backup, informing dispatch that he had detained a suspect in a possible burglary. His transmission made no mention of the fact that the suspect claimed to be the homeowner's son. It included nothing about the matching last name on the identification. It said nothing about the offers to verify the story. He simply reported that he had located an African-American male inside a residence that was supposed to be unoccupied. The backup unit arrived within 6 minutes. Officer Tanya Reeves pulled her cruiser to the curb just as Holloway was removing handcuffs from his belt. Reeves was relatively new to the department, with just over 2 years of service, but she had a sharp eye for details and a genuine commitment to doing the job correctly. As she walked up the pathway toward the house, she noticed several things that apparently had escaped her senior colleague's attention. The mailbox at the end of the driveway was overflowing with envelopes and catalogs. When she glanced at the addresses, she saw that some of the mail was addressed to Eleanor Chambers and some was addressed to Michael Chambers at the same address. Inside the still open front door, she could see a small table in the entryway. Sitting on that table was a set of keys, the kind of everyday household keys that suggested someone with legitimate access, not a burglar's lockpicks. Next to the keys sat several framed photographs. Even from the doorway, she could see that at least one of them showed an older white woman standing next to a younger black man. They were smiling, their postures suggesting the easy intimacy of family. Reeves approached Holloway quietly and mentioned what she had observed: the mail with his name on it, the family photographs visible from the doorway, the overall appearance of a home being cared for rather than burglarized. She suggested carefully that perhaps they should take a few minutes to verify the man's story before proceeding with the arrest. Holloway's response would later become a crucial piece of evidence in the internal investigation. He told Reeves that he had the situation under control and did not need her second-guessing his judgment. His tone was dismissive, the kind of voice a veteran uses to put a junior officer in their place. He was committed to his course of action, and he was not about to show uncertainty in front of someone with less experience. It would make him look weak. It would undermine his authority. So instead of pausing to consider that he might be wrong, he doubled down on being right. This was the moment when a simple misunderstanding became an impending disaster. Pride and stubbornness were about to transform an embarrassing error into a career-ending catastrophe, and Michael Chambers, standing handcuffed on his own front porch, was about to become the face of a national conversation about racial profiling in American policing. The neighborhood had begun to take notice. Curtains moved in windows across the street. A few residents stepped out onto their porches, drawn by the presence of 2 police vehicles and the sight of a man in handcuffs. Among them was Gladys Turner, a retired nurse in her late 60s who had lived on Thornwood Lane for almost 40 years. She had known Eleanor Chambers since before Michael was born. She had watched him grow up, had attended his high school graduation party, had seen him come and go from that house countless times over the decades. Gladys approached Officer Reeves, her face tight with concern and confusion. She tried to explain that the man in handcuffs was Eleanor's son, that she had seen him around the neighborhood for the past few days, and knew he was there to look after things while his mother recovered. She said his name was Michael, that he was a good man, an accountant, that this was obviously some kind of terrible mistake. Reeves listened to this information carefully. Here was a third-party witness, a longtime neighbor with no apparent motive to lie, confirming exactly what Michael had been saying all along. Reeves tried once more to share this with Holloway, but he was already on his radio requesting a transport vehicle. He was not listening. He was not interested in information that contradicted the arrest he was determined to make. While they waited for transport, Michael made one final attempt to resolve the situation peacefully. His voice, still calm but now carrying an edge of desperation, asked Officer Holloway to simply make one phone call, just one. Call Millbrook General Hospital and ask to be connected to Eleanor Chambers' room. She was awake, she was alert, and she could clear this entire thing up in less than 5 minutes. It was such a simple request, such an easy way to avoid what was about to happen. But Holloway refused. He said the investigation would be conducted properly at the station and that Michael would have ample opportunity to tell his story to detectives there. This refusal would later be cited as one of the most egregious failures of judgment in the entire incident. One phone call. That was all it would have taken. One phone call to verify an easily confirmable story. Instead, Holloway chose to maintain control, to assert his authority, to proceed as if the evidence of his own eyes and ears meant nothing. The transport van arrived at 3:48 in the afternoon. Michael Chambers, 44 years old, a licensed CPA with no criminal record, a man who had driven 90 minutes to help his elderly mother, was loaded into the back of a police vehicle like a common criminal. The body camera captured his face as the van door closed. He looked exhausted, confused, and deeply sad. Not angry, which perhaps he had every right to be. Just profoundly, devastatingly sad. During the 15-minute drive to the Millbrook Police Department, something extraordinary was happening back on Thornwood Lane. Gladys Turner was not content to let this injustice proceed unchallenged. She had Eleanor's cell phone number stored in her phone, and as soon as the transport van disappeared around the corner, she placed a call. Eleanor answered on the third ring. Her voice was slightly groggy, the lingering effects of pain medication following her surgery, but she was alert enough to understand what Gladys was telling her. Her son had been arrested at her house by police officers who refused to believe he was her son and would not even make a phone call to verify his identity. Eleanor's response was immediate and volcanic. Decades of teaching middle school had given her a particular talent for controlled fury, and she deployed it now with devastating effect. She demanded to know which police department had taken her son. She demanded phone numbers. She demanded names. And then she told Gladys to find someone who could drive her to the police station immediately, because she was checking herself out of this hospital right now. Doctor's orders be damned. At the station, Michael was being processed through the booking system. His fingerprints were scanned into the database. His belongings, including his wallet, keys, and cell phone, were cataloged and placed in a clear plastic bag. He was photographed from multiple angles, front and profile, the standard intake documentation for criminal suspects. Each step of this process was another indignity, another layer of humiliation for a man who had done nothing wrong. The desk sergeant on duty that afternoon was a 23-year veteran named Howard Dietrich. Dietrich had processed thousands of arrests over his career, and he had developed an instinct for recognizing when something did not add up. When he reviewed Holloway's preliminary paperwork, a detail caught his attention immediately. The suspect's driver's license showed his address as 892 Thornwood Lane, the exact same address where he had allegedly been trespassing. Dietrich had encountered plenty of burglars in his time. They did not typically carry identification that linked them directly to the scene of their supposed crime. He asked Holloway to clarify this discrepancy, and Holloway's response raised even more red flags. Holloway suggested that the suspect was probably using forged documents or had somehow obtained the homeowner's personal information to create fake identification. These explanations made no logical sense. They were the rationalizations of someone trying to justify a decision rather than seeking the truth. Dietrich documented his concerns in the intake notes, but did not have the authority to override the arresting officer's judgment. Michael was placed in a holding cell while Holloway began preparing his formal arrest report. This was the stage at which a genuine investigation should have commenced. Instead, Holloway focused his energy on constructing a narrative that justified his actions rather than examining whether those actions were justified. His written report described Michael as evasive and uncooperative, characterizations that were directly contradicted by every second of body camera footage. He noted that the suspect had offered various excuses for his presence in the residence, framing reasonable explanations as suspicious deflections. He failed to mention that the suspect's identification showed the same last name as the property owner. He omitted any reference to the neighbor who had vouched for Michael's identity. The report was not an objective account of what had happened. It was a document designed to support a predetermined conclusion. At 4:25 in the afternoon, the main switchboard at the police station began lighting up. Eleanor Chambers was calling from her hospital bed, and she was not in a mood to be transferred to voicemail or placed on hold. She demanded to speak with someone in charge about her son's arrest. The call was eventually routed to Detective Carmen Vasquez, a 15-year veteran who handled major crimes investigations and had a reputation for thoroughness. Vasquez listened with growing disbelief as Eleanor explained the situation. Her son Michael had driven in from Columbus 5 days ago to help care for her house during her recovery. He had been staying there with her full knowledge and explicit permission. He had a key she had given him years ago. His name was on documents related to the property. And now the police had arrested him for burglary and trespassing in his own family home. The detective immediately pulled up the arrest file and saw what should have been obvious to everyone from the beginning: the matching last names, the address on the driver's license, the complete absence of any physical evidence that a crime had been committed. No forced entry, no stolen property, no victim. Just a black man in a house that belonged to his white mother and a police officer who had decided that combination was inherently criminal. Vasquez walked down to the holding area to speak with Michael personally. What she found was not the evasive, uncooperative suspect described in Holloway's report. She found a well-spoken, clearly educated man who explained his situation with remarkable patience and dignity, given what he had been through. He showed her photographs on his phone, pictures of him and his mother at Thanksgiving dinners, birthday parties, graduations, all taken inside the house on Thornwood Lane. He provided contact information for relatives, friends, and his mother's physician who could all verify his identity and his relationship to Eleanor. Vasquez realized immediately that a catastrophic error had been made. She contacted Holloway and asked him to come to her office to discuss the case. When he arrived, she methodically laid out every piece of evidence that proved Michael's innocence: the identical last names, the family photographs, the neighbor's testimony, the fact that Eleanor Chambers herself was on the phone right now demanding her son's release. What happened next would become perhaps the most damning element of the entire investigation. Instead of acknowledging his mistake, instead of showing any recognition that he had wrongfully arrested an innocent man, Holloway doubled down. He suggested that Michael might be running some kind of elaborate confidence scheme. He speculated that perhaps Michael had manipulated an elderly woman into believing he was her son. He even floated the theory that the family photographs could have been digitally fabricated. These conspiracy theories were so disconnected from reality, so obviously desperate attempts to avoid accountability, that Vasquez later testified she questioned whether Holloway was experiencing some kind of psychological break. She documented his statements carefully, knowing they would become critical evidence in the internal affairs investigation that was now inevitable. At 5:05 in the afternoon, Eleanor Chambers arrived at the Millbrook Police Department. She was in a wheelchair, having checked herself out of the hospital against explicit medical advice. Her knee was still heavily bandaged from the surgery she had undergone 12 days earlier, and she was clearly in pain. But there was a fire in her eyes that suggested pain was the least of her concerns at that moment. Gladys Turner had driven her from the hospital, and 2 other longtime neighbors from Thornwood Lane had come along for support and to serve as witnesses. Eleanor wheeled herself up to the front desk and demanded in a voice that carried throughout the lobby that someone bring her son to her immediately. She announced that if he was not released within the hour, she would be calling every television station, every newspaper, and every civil rights organization in the state of Ohio. The desk sergeant, recognizing the severity of the situation, quickly arranged for Eleanor to be brought back to the holding area. The reunion between mother and son was captured on the security cameras in the holding area. It would later be described by witnesses as one of the most heartbreaking things they had ever seen. Eleanor, still in her hospital gown with a police department blanket draped over her shoulders, broke down in tears the moment she saw Michael behind the bars of the holding cell. This was her son, her only child, the baby she had raised in that house on Thornwood Lane, and he was being treated like a criminal. Michael, who had maintained his composure throughout the entire ordeal, finally allowed his emotions to surface. Tears streamed down his face as he reached through the bars to hold his mother's hand. Think about that image for a moment. An elderly woman in a wheelchair, fresh from surgery, weeping outside a jail cell that holds her son. A son whose only crime was helping his mother while she recovered from that surgery. This is what Assumption looks like when it is given the power of a badge and a gun. This is the human cost of prejudice. If this story is affecting you the way it is affecting me, I want to hear from you. Drop a comment below and tell me what you are feeling right now, because we are not even close to the end of this story, and the consequences are about to get much more severe. Captain William Okonkwo, the watch commander, arrived at the station at 5:22 in the afternoon. He had been called in from his day off after Detective Vasquez briefed him on the rapidly deteriorating situation. Okonkwo was a 30-year veteran of law enforcement, a former state trooper who had joined the Millbrook Department specifically to help improve community relations. He had seen bad arrests before, but he had rarely seen one this clear-cut, this completely unjustifiable, this thoroughly documented. He reviewed the body camera footage, the arrest report, the witness statements, and the preliminary findings from Detective Vasquez. Then he ordered Michael Chambers released immediately. No charges would be filed. The arrest would be expunged from the system, but everyone in that station knew that erasing the record would not erase what had happened. Okonkwo then summoned Officer Derek Holloway to his office for what would become the most consequential conversation of Holloway's career. The captain's door closed, and for the next 45 minutes, the 2 men were alone. What was said in that room would later be reconstructed from Okonkwo's testimony during the internal affairs investigation. The captain had reviewed every piece of evidence. He had watched the body camera footage multiple times. He had read the witness statements from neighbors who had known the Chambers family for decades. He had spoken personally with Eleanor Chambers, who was still in the station lobby refusing to leave until she received answers. There was no angle, no interpretation, no possible framing that made Holloway's actions look like acceptable police work. Holloway attempted to defend himself by insisting he had followed proper procedures. Okonkwo dismantled this claim methodically. Proper procedures would have required verifying the suspect's story before making an arrest. Proper procedures would have included checking property records to determine who lived at the address. Proper procedures would have involved listening to witness testimony from residents who could confirm the suspect's identity. Proper procedures would have meant treating a cooperative citizen with basic dignity instead of rushing to judgment. And then Okonkwo arrived at the unspoken truth that had hung over the entire incident. He did not say the words racial profiling directly. He did not need to. The silence in that office was heavy with everything that did not need to be said. A black man was arrested for entering his own mother's house because a neighbor saw his skin color and assumed he was a criminal. A police officer looked at that same man, saw that same skin color, and decided to ignore every piece of evidence that contradicted his predetermined conclusion. There was no way to explain what had happened without acknowledging the role that race had played in every decision, from the initial 911 call to the handcuffs clicking shut on the front porch. The internal affairs investigation was initiated that same evening. Holloway was placed on administrative leave, effective immediately, pending the outcome of the inquiry. His body camera footage was secured as evidence. All documentation related to the arrest was collected and cataloged. His badge and service weapon were surrendered. By the time he left the station that night, Officer Derek Holloway was a police officer in name only. The department understood what was coming. They were facing a potential lawsuit that could reach into the millions of dollars. Their reputation in the community, already strained by years of tension, was about to be shattered. Every decision made in the next few days would be scrutinized by lawyers, journalists, and civil rights advocates. The wrong move could turn a local embarrassment into a national scandal. Word of the arrest began spreading through social media that same night. Gladys Turner, the neighbor who had tried to intervene on Michael's behalf, had taken photographs of him handcuffed on his own front porch. Those images, showing a well-dressed man in restraints while standing in front of a house he clearly belonged to, were posted online with a detailed account of what had transpired. Within hours, the post had been shared thousands of times. The story had every element needed to capture public attention. An innocent man wrongfully arrested in his own family home. Clear documentation of what appeared to be racial profiling. A police officer who refused to admit his obvious mistake even when confronted with overwhelming evidence. These ingredients combined into a viral moment that transcended local news coverage and entered the national conversation. Local television crews arrived at 892 Thornwood Lane by the following morning. Satellite trucks lined the quiet residential street, their antenna masts rising above the trees like strange mechanical flowers. Reporters knocked on doors throughout the neighborhood, seeking interviews with anyone who had witnessed the arrest or knew the Chambers family. The story led the evening news on every major station in the region. By the following day, national media outlets had picked it up, and Officer Derek Holloway's mistake had become a symbol of everything critics said was wrong with American policing. But the media attention was only the beginning of Holloway's downfall. The real consequences were still gathering on the horizon, and they would be far more severe than anyone could have anticipated. The civil rights attorneys arrived within 4 days of the arrest. Jennifer Okafor and Terrence Mitchell were partners at the Progress Legal Fund, a nonprofit organization that specialized in police misconduct cases. They had built their careers on holding law enforcement accountable for violations of constitutional rights, and their track record included several multi-million-dollar settlements against police departments across the Midwest. When they reviewed the body camera footage and witness statements from the Chambers case, they immediately recognized its significance. Michael Chambers sat across from them in their downtown Cleveland office, still processing the surreal transformation his life had undergone. Less than a week earlier, he had been a successful accountant whose primary concern was making sure his mother's azaleas got enough water while she recovered from surgery. Now he was being discussed on cable news shows, his name trending on social media, his face appearing in articles about racial profiling and police reform. Okafor explained their options with the clarity of someone who had given this presentation many times before. They could pursue both civil and criminal remedies. The civil lawsuit would seek monetary damages for the violation of Michael's Fourth Amendment rights against unreasonable seizure, his 14th Amendment right to equal protection under the law, false imprisonment, and emotional distress. They would name Officer Holloway personally, the Millbrook Police Department, and the city itself as defendants. The criminal referral would push for charges against Holloway for false arrest, official misconduct, and potential civil rights violations under federal law. Michael listened to all of this with the particular expression of someone who never imagined himself in such a situation. He was not a political activist. He was not someone who had spent his life thinking about police reform or racial justice. He was an accountant who had simply wanted to help his mother. But the events of that Thursday afternoon had thrust him into a role he had never sought. and he was beginning to understand that he had both an opportunity and a responsibility to ensure that what happened to him could not happen as easily to someone else. While Michael considered his legal options, the Millbrook Police Department was in full crisis mode. Chief Angela Nowak had called an emergency meeting with the mayor, the city attorney, and the department's public affairs officer. They all understood the severity of the situation. The body camera footage was unambiguous. The witness statements were consistent. The victim was articulate and sympathetic. And the arresting officer had not only made an indefensible mistake, but had refused to acknowledge it even when confronted with overwhelming evidence of his error. The department's initial strategy was standard damage control. They released a carefully worded statement indicating that the incident was under investigation and that the department took all allegations of misconduct seriously. They expressed concern for all parties involved and promised that appropriate action would be taken based on the findings of the inquiry. But this generic bureaucratic language only inflamed public sentiment further. The community did not want corporate speak. They wanted accountability. They wanted to know that the officer who had arrested an innocent man in his own home would face real consequences. Protesters began organizing outside the police station, carrying signs demanding Holloway's immediate termination. Holloway, meanwhile, had retained his own attorney. Daniel Prescott was a former assistant district attorney who now specialized in defending police officers accused of misconduct. Prescott had a reputation for aggressive tactics and had successfully defended numerous officers in cases that seemed unwinnable. But when he reviewed the evidence in Holloway's case, his assessment was grim. Prescott sat across from his client in his oak-paneled office and delivered the news as directly as he could. The case was indefensible from a legal standpoint. Every decision Holloway had made was wrong, and all of it was documented on video. The body camera footage showed a cooperative suspect offering multiple ways to verify his story, and an officer ignoring every one of them. The aftermath showed that same officer suggesting conspiracy theories rather than acknowledging an obvious mistake. No jury would find this acceptable. No judge would look at this evidence and conclude that proper procedures were followed. Prescott advised Holloway to consider cooperating fully with the internal investigation and expressing genuine remorse for his actions. This approach might help mitigate the penalties. It might preserve his pension. Even if his career was over, it might prevent criminal prosecution, but it required something Holloway seemed unable to provide, an admission that he had been wrong. Instead, Holloway remained defiant. He insisted that he had followed established procedures. He maintained that the entire situation was being blown out of proportion by media outlets seeking to manufacture controversy. He blamed the neighbor who had made the original 911 call. He blamed the department for not supporting him. He blamed everyone except the person actually responsible for what had happened. This attitude became painfully apparent during his formal interview with internal affairs investigators. The session was recorded, and the footage would later become a key exhibit in multiple legal proceedings. Over the course of 3 hours, Holloway demonstrated no genuine understanding of how his actions had harmed an innocent man and his family. He showed no recognition that his behavior violated fundamental principles of constitutional policing. He offered no meaningful apology, only deflections and justifications. The investigators left the interview room convinced that Holloway posed an ongoing liability to the department and the community. Detective Vasquez, who had discovered the error and facilitated Michael's release, was also interviewed as part of the investigation. Her testimony was particularly damaging because it came from a fellow officer with no personal stake in the outcome. She described in detail how Holloway had ignored obvious evidence and refused to consider any alternative explanation for Michael's presence in the house. She recounted his conspiracy theories about forged photographs and elderly women being manipulated. She characterized his behavior as unprofessional, unreasonable, and potentially evidence of deeper issues that the department should have identified and addressed long before this incident occurred. The neighbor who had initiated the entire chain of events was also brought in for questioning. Patricia Holbrook was a 75-year-old widow who had lived on Thornwood Lane for 16 years. Under questioning from internal affairs investigators, she admitted that her primary reason for calling the police was that she had never seen the black man before, and his presence in the neighborhood made her uncomfortable. She acknowledged that she had not attempted to introduce herself to him or ask why he was at Eleanor's house. She confessed that she felt terrible about what had happened and wished she had simply walked over and said hello, rather than assuming the worst and calling 911. This admission was particularly significant because it highlighted how implicit bias had triggered the entire cascade of events. Holbrook's assumptions about a black man in a predominantly white neighborhood led to the police call. Holloway's assumptions about the same man led to the wrongful arrest. Each link in the chain was connected by the same thread of prejudice, the same willingness to see threat where none existed, the same failure to extend basic human courtesy to someone who happened to look different. A court order, sought by media organizations invoking public records laws, forced the department to release the body camera footage to the public. The response was immediate and overwhelming. Watching the video was an excruciating experience for anyone with a basic sense of justice. Michael's patience and professionalism were evident in every frame. His attempts to de-escalate, to provide information, to offer verification were all clearly visible and audible. In contrast, Holloway's hostility and tunnel vision were impossible to ignore. He had decided what was happening before he walked up those front steps, and nothing Michael said or did could penetrate that predetermined conclusion. Legal experts who analyzed the footage for news programs were unanimous in their assessment. Holloway had violated Michael's Fourth Amendment rights against unreasonable seizure. He had failed to conduct even the most basic investigation before making an arrest. He had disregarded exculpatory evidence that was literally being handed to him. And underlying all of these procedural failures was the unmistakable influence of racial bias on his judgment and actions. The police union initially rallied behind Holloway, as unions typically do when officers face allegations of misconduct. They released a statement emphasizing the dangers that officers face in the field and the split-second decisions they must sometimes make under pressure. But as the full scope of the evidence became public, even union leadership began creating distance from Holloway's actions. This case was too clear-cut, too thoroughly documented, too completely indefensible. Supporting Holloway risked undermining the union's credibility in future cases where the facts might be more ambiguous. 4 weeks after the arrest, the district attorney's office announced that criminal charges would be filed against Officer Derek Holloway. He was indicted on counts of false imprisonment, deprivation of rights under color of law, and official misconduct. These were serious felony charges that could result in significant prison time if he were convicted. The announcement sent ripples through law enforcement communities across the state. Police officers rarely faced criminal prosecution for actions taken in the line of duty, even when those actions were clearly improper. The fact that prosecutors were willing to charge Holloway signaled that this case was different. The evidence was so overwhelming, the conduct so egregious, that criminal liability could not be avoided through the usual institutional protections. The pressure of the criminal charges, the civil lawsuit, and the public scrutiny began to take a toll on every aspect of Holloway's life. His wife, Karen, worked as a dental hygienist at practice in a neighboring town. She found herself facing uncomfortable questions from coworkers and patients who had seen the news coverage. Some were sympathetic, but others were openly hostile, viewing her as complicit in her husband's actions simply by remaining married to him. Their teenage son became the target of bullying at school. Classmates shared screenshots of news articles and social media posts mocking his father. The family received threatening phone calls and anonymous hate mail from people across the country who had seen the story and wanted to express their fury. The financial impact was equally devastating. Holloway had been suspended without pay, pending the resolution of the criminal and administrative proceedings. Legal fees were accumulating rapidly, each court appearance and motion draining the family's savings account. Karen increased her hours at work, but the additional income barely covered the gap left by her husband's missing salary. The comfortable suburban existence they had built over 8 years as a law enforcement family was crumbling around them. I want to pause here for a moment to acknowledge something important. This story is not just about one bad cop getting what he deserved. It is about what happens when the systems we create to protect us instead become instruments of harm. Holloway made terrible choices, and he deserves the consequences that are coming. But he was also a product of inadequate training, permissive policies, and a culture that allowed complaints about his behavior to be dismissed for years before this incident occurred. The question we should all be asking is not just whether Holloway should be punished, But how many other officers are out there right now carrying the same biases, making the same assumptions, and one wrong call away from destroying an innocent person's life? What do you think needs to change to prevent cases like this from happening in the first place? I genuinely want to know. Leave your thoughts in the comments below. Michael Chambers was facing his own challenges in the aftermath of the arrest. The trauma of the experience manifested in ways he had not anticipated. He found himself hypervigilant whenever he encountered police officers, his heart rate accelerating even during routine traffic stops. Simple activities like driving through an unfamiliar neighborhood became sources of anxiety. The sense of safety and belonging that most citizens take for granted had been stripped away from him in those minutes on his mother's front porch, and he did not know if he would ever fully recover it. The media attention was a double-edged sword. On one hand, it helped ensure that his story was heard and that pressure for accountability remained strong. On the other hand, it transformed him from a private citizen into a public symbol, whether he wanted that role or not. Reporters called constantly, seeking interviews and comments. Strangers recognized him on the street, some offering sympathy and support, others making hostile remarks that revealed their view that he had somehow brought this on himself or was exploiting the situation for personal gain. The quiet life he had built as an accountant seemed impossibly distant. Eleanor Chambers suffered as well, perhaps more than anyone. The stress of witnessing her son's arrest and the chaotic days that followed had complicated her recovery from surgery. She developed an infection at the surgical site that required additional treatment and extended her hospital stay by nearly 3 weeks beyond the original prognosis. The medical bills accumulated at an alarming rate, and while insurance covered some of the costs, significant expenses remained. She blamed herself for asking Michael to stay at the house. If she had simply hired a neighbor to check on things, or let the mail pile up for a couple of weeks, none of this would have happened. That guilt, irrational as it might be, added another layer of suffering to an already painful situation. The civil lawsuit moved forward through the courts on multiple parallel tracks. Okafor and Mitchell filed their complaint against Holloway personally, the Millbrook Police Department, and the city government. They alleged violations of Michael's constitutional rights under the 4th and 14th Amendments, negligent hiring, training, and supervision of officers, and municipal liability for maintaining policies that enabled and perhaps encouraged racial profiling in policing. The damages they sought were substantial: compensatory damages for the direct harm Michael had suffered, punitive damages intended to punish egregious misconduct and deter similar behavior in the future, attorneys' fees, costs associated with the ongoing emotional and psychological impact of the arrest. The total figure they proposed exceeded $3 million. The discovery process in the civil case revealed patterns in Holloway's behavior that should have been addressed long before the Chambers incident. His personnel file contained 5 previous complaints about racial bias in his interactions with citizens, all of which had been dismissed or downplayed by supervisors. Multiple citizens had complained about his aggressive treatment during traffic stops, particularly involving minority drivers. One complaint alleged that Holloway had stopped the same black teenager 3 times in a single month without ever finding any evidence of wrongdoing. These warning signs had been documented but never acted upon. Training records showed that Holloway had received minimal instruction on implicit bias and constitutional policing. The department's policies on investigating suspicious activity were vague and outdated, providing little guidance on how officers should verify claims made by suspects before proceeding with arrests. There was no clear protocol requiring that a suspect's story be investigated when it could be easily verified through a simple phone call. These systemic failures meant that even if Holloway was an outlier, the department had created conditions in which similar mistakes could happen again and again. The criminal case against Holloway moved more slowly through the system. His attorney filed numerous motions seeking to have the charges dismissed or reduced. He challenged the admissibility of the body camera footage on technical grounds. He argued that Holloway had acted in good faith based on the information available to him at the time, but the footage was too clear, too comprehensive, too damning. No legal maneuvering could explain away Holloway's repeated refusals to verify Michael's story, his dismissal of witness testimony, his conspiracy theories when confronted with evidence of his error. Plea negotiations began in earnest about 3 months after the indictment. The prosecutor offered Holloway a deal that would involve pleading guilty to reduced charges in exchange for his resignation from the police force, forfeiture of his law enforcement certification, and probation rather than prison time. Holloway's initial reaction was to reject the offer. He still believed, or claimed to believe, that he could prevail at trial. But as the months passed and his legal bills continued to mount, as his attorney explained again and again the likely outcome of a jury trial given the evidence, Holloway's resolve began to crack. The video was impossible to overcome. Public sentiment was overwhelmingly against him. A trial would be expensive, humiliating, and almost certain to result in conviction on the most serious charges. The possibility of actual prison time became increasingly real. The department's internal investigation concluded with a report that left no room for ambiguity. The investigators found that Holloway had violated numerous departmental policies and had brought significant discredit upon the entire organization. They recommended his immediate termination for cause. Even if he were somehow acquitted of criminal charges, his career with the Millbrook Police Department was finished. 7 months after Michael Chambers was arrested on his mother's front porch, Derek Holloway accepted the plea agreement. He pleaded guilty to official misconduct and false imprisonment. The sentence was 18 months of probation, 200 hours of community service, and permanent revocation of his law enforcement certification. He would never be allowed to work as a police officer anywhere in the state of Ohio again. The guilty plea was not an admission of racial bias. Holloway never acknowledged that his treatment of Michael was influenced by the color of Michael's skin. He framed his statement to the court in terms of procedural errors and failures of judgment, carefully avoiding any reference to the elephant that had been in the room from the very beginning. But everyone who had followed the case understood what had really happened, even if the legal documents danced around it. The civil settlement came 4 months later. After extensive negotiations, the city of Millbrook agreed to pay Michael Chambers $3.2 million to resolve all claims arising from his wrongful arrest. The settlement included not only the monetary compensation, but also a series of binding commitments to reform police practices. The department agreed to implement comprehensive training on implicit bias for all officers. They agreed to update their policies on investigating suspicious activity calls, including clear protocols requiring verification of a suspect's claims when such verification is easily obtainable. They agreed to establish new oversight mechanisms for handling citizen complaints about officer conduct. They agreed to create a civilian review board with real authority to investigate allegations of misconduct. These reforms were not just talking points or press release material. They were enforceable provisions of the settlement agreement, subject to monitoring by an independent third party for a period of 5 years. If the department failed to implement them, they would face additional legal consequences. For once, accountability came with teeth. The aftermath of the settlement marked the beginning of divergent paths for the two men whose lives had collided so catastrophically on that Thursday afternoon. Derek Holloway's existence after the plea agreement became a study in consequences. His criminal record followed him everywhere, appearing on every background check, requiring disclosure on every job application. The specific details of his case had been so widely publicized that even employers who might otherwise have overlooked a minor conviction were unlikely to take a chance on him. The name Derek Holloway had become synonymous in certain circles with racial profiling and abuse of power. He found occasional work in construction and warehouse logistics, jobs where his past was less likely to be discovered or less likely to matter to the employers. But the stability and respect he had enjoyed as a police officer were gone forever. Former colleagues avoided him, unwilling to be associated with someone who had brought such negative attention to their profession. The brotherhood of law enforcement, which had been such an important part of his identity, had expelled him without ceremony or farewell. His marriage could not survive the strain. Karen filed for divorce 14 months after the plea agreement. The financial hardship, the public humiliation, and what she described in court filings as his complete inability to acknowledge his own wrongdoing had made the relationship impossible to sustain. The custody arrangement for their son was complicated by Holloway's criminal record and the circumstances of his conviction. He was granted supervised visitation, but the relationship with his child would never be the same. Holloway eventually relocated to another state, seeking anonymity in a place where his face and name were not immediately recognized. Whether he ever truly understood the harm he had caused, whether he ever came to terms with the biases that had shaped his actions on that autumn afternoon, remained unclear. Some people who encountered him in his new life described a man consumed by bitterness, convinced he had been the victim of a politically motivated persecution. Others reported moments of what seemed like genuine reflection and regret. Perhaps both accounts were true. People are complicated, even people who have done great harm. Michael Chambers took a different path. The settlement money provided financial security, but he found that security brought little comfort without purpose. The experience had changed him in fundamental ways. He could not simply return to his previous life as though nothing had happened. He had seen something that demanded a response. He established the Eleanor Chambers Foundation, named after his mother, with a mission focused on police accountability and community relations. The foundation funded legal representation for people who believed they had been victims of police misconduct but lacked the resources to pursue civil remedies. It supported community organizations working to build better relationships between law enforcement and the neighborhoods they served. It provided educational programs aimed at helping both citizens and officers understand their rights and responsibilities. Michael became a reluctant but effective advocate for criminal justice reform. He spoke at conferences and community forums. He testified before state legislators considering police oversight bills. He met with police chiefs and training officers to share his perspective and discuss practical ways to prevent similar incidents. His story had given him a platform, and he used it to push for systemic changes that might protect others from experiencing what he had experienced. He never became comfortable with the public role. He was, at heart, still the accountant who had just wanted to water his mother's plants, but he understood that his discomfort was far less important than the opportunity to make a difference. If his story could help one other person avoid the trauma of wrongful arrest, if his advocacy could contribute to policies that made policing more just and equitable, then the pain he had endured would have meaning beyond his own experience. Eleanor recovered fully from her surgery, though the psychological scars of witnessing her son's arrest took longer to heal. She became active in the foundation her son had created, attending events and sharing her perspective as the mother of someone who had been wrongly targeted by police. Her voice carrying the authority of her years and the particular moral clarity of someone who had spent a career educating young people added weight to the cause. The neighbors on Thornwood Lane processed the incident in their own ways. Some were chastened by what had happened, recognizing their own potential for making similar assumptions about people who looked different. Others struggled to acknowledge any responsibility, preferring to see the whole thing as an unfortunate misunderstanding rather than a symptom of deeper problems. Patricia Holbrook, the neighbor whose 911 call had started everything, eventually reached out to Michael directly to apologize. Their conversation was difficult, but ultimately healing for both of them. She had not intended harm. She had simply never learned to question the assumptions that shaped her perception of who belonged and who did not. The broader impact of the case extended far beyond the individuals directly involved. Police departments throughout Ohio and across the country began reviewing their training programs and policies on racial bias in light of what had happened in Millbrook. The Chambers case became a standard example in criminal justice courses and law enforcement academies, a cautionary tale about the dangers of assumption and the importance of verification. Reform advocates pointed to the case as evidence that accountability was possible when the evidence was clear and the pressure was sustained. Critics argued that it represented the rare exception rather than the rule, that countless similar incidents occurred without such clear documentation or such sustained public attention. Both perspectives contained truth. The Chambers case was both a victory for justice and a reminder of how much injustice still occurred without consequence. This brings us to the end of this story, but I want to leave you with something to think about. What happened to Michael Chambers was not primarily about one bad officer making one bad decision. It was about a system that allowed bias to flourish unchecked, that prioritized authority over accountability, that made it easier to arrest an innocent man than to make a simple phone call to verify his story. Derek Holloway bears responsibility for his choices, but so do the supervisors who dismissed previous complaints about his behavior. So does the department that failed to provide adequate training on constitutional policing. So does a culture that treats certain people as inherently suspicious simply because of how they look. Change is possible. The reforms implemented in Millbrook as part of the settlement agreement prove that. But change requires sustained attention and continued pressure. It requires people who are willing to speak up when they witness injustice, like Gladys Turner did. It requires officers willing to question their colleagues, like Tanya Reeves tried to do. It requires citizens willing to demand accountability, like Eleanor Chambers demanded for her son. And it requires all of us to examine our own assumptions about who belongs and who does not, who deserves the benefit of the doubt and who does not. Who gets to walk through their mother's neighborhood without being viewed as a threat? Michael Chambers did nothing wrong on that Thursday afternoon. He was simply existing in a space where someone decided he did not belong. That judgment, made first by a neighbor and then reinforced by an officer of the law, changed his life forever. But he refused to let it define him. He took an experience of profound injustice and transformed it into a force for meaningful change. Sometimes justice comes slowly. Sometimes it arrives with a price tag that cannot repair all the damage done. But when people stand up, when they refuse to accept the unacceptable, justice does come. That is the lesson of what happened on Thornwood Lane. It is a lesson worth remembering and worth fighting for every single day. If this story moved you, if it made you think about police accountability or racial bias, or simply the importance of verifying information before making life-altering decisions, I would love to hear your thoughts. Leave a comment below and let me know what you took away from Michael's story. And if you are not already subscribed to this channel, consider joining us. We tell stories like this one every week, stories about justice and injustice, about systems that fail, and the people who fight to make them better. Thank you for watching. Thank you for listening. And I will see you in the next one.